She fled when the Alpha King marked an omega. Now he is tearing the veil between worlds to rescue her. Prologue. Katherine had always believed that promises made before birth were the most sacred kind. The ones written in starlight and sealed by ancient magic. The ones that couldn't be broken even if you wanted to. She was wrong. The morning she stood hidden in the shadows of the throne room and watched Alpha King Julius mark another woman, Katherine learned that even destiny could be twisted by the right kind of darkness. That love promised since before either of them drew breath could be poisoned by enchantment and ambition. That the man she'd fallen genuinely, desperately in love with could look at someone else with blind devotion, while Katherine's heart shattered into pieces so small she'd never find them all. The woman was an omega named Seraphina, delicate and beautiful and ambitious in ways Katherine hadn't recognized until it was too late. And the magic she'd used was older than kingdoms, darker than moonless nights, pulled from a place beyond the veil where forgotten things waited with infinite patience for revenge. Katherine had believed herself prepared for a life of duty and arranged obligation that might never bloom into real feeling. She'd been raised to expect disappointment, to make peace with being a political piece rather than a chosen partner. What she hadn't been prepared for was loving Julius with her whole soul, only to watch him give away what should have been hers to another woman just hours before their mating ceremony was supposed to begin. So Katherine ran into forests that whispered warnings, ran from a future that had turned to ash, ran until her lungs burned and her ceremonial gown tore on thorns and her tears finally ran dry. But she didn't run far enough, because what Katherine didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the moment Julius's mark touched Seraphina's skin, an ancient law activated. The law of the bond, designed centuries ago to protect true mates from false claims, shattered the enchantment like glass. And the Alpha King, who'd been blind with manufactured devotion, suddenly saw clearly for the first time in months, saw what he'd done, saw what he'd lost, and realized that the woman running away into the darkness was the only real thing he'd ever had. But by then, Katherine was already gone, and the entities beyond the veil, the ones who'd orchestrated this entire catastrophe, were just beginning to make their next move. Because breaking Katherine and Julius apart had only been the opening gambit. The real terror was about to begin. If you love intense stories about wolves, with destiny and twists and turns, subscribe to the channel now. We post videos every day, so subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any episodes. How about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, author of the stories, and you. Comment below with your name and which city you're watching from. Chapter 1. The morning Katherine woke to find Alpha King Julius standing in the throne room with another woman's scent wrapped around him like a second skin, she understood that fairy tales were just another word for lies. She'd been awake since before dawn, preparing herself for what should have been the happiest day of her life. In exactly 3 hours, the mating ceremony would begin, the sacred ritual that would officially bind her to Julius, the man she'd been promised to since before either of them had drawn their first breath, and the man she'd fallen desperately, genuinely in love with the moment they'd finally met 6 months ago. Katherine had spent those 6 months learning every detail of his face. The way his amber eyes softened when he smiled at her in the palace gardens. The sound of his laugh when she told him terrible jokes just to hear it. The gentle way his fingers would brush against hers during their evening walks, as if he was always reaching for her but afraid to hold on too tight. She'd fallen in love with a king who read poetry in secret, who remembered the names of every servant in the castle, who stayed up late helping the kitchen staff when they were short-handed during festivals, and who looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world made of obligations and ancient laws. And now, standing in the shadowed alcove at the entrance to the throne room with her ceremonial gown already laced tight around her ribs, Katherine watched as that same man held someone else with a tenderness that made her stomach turn to ice. The woman was small, blonde, beautiful in that delicate way that made powerful men feel protective instead of threatened. An omega, Katherine realized with a jolt that felt like falling, even though her feet hadn't moved. The woman's name was Seraphina, one of the castle administrators who'd worked quietly in the records office for the past year. Always polite, always efficient, always there. Always watching Julius with eyes that held too much hunger for someone who was supposed to be simply loyal. But it was the way Julius looked at her, at Seraphina, that made Katherine's breath catch in her throat like a trapped bird. He stared at the Omega with an expression Katherine had never seen before, blind devotion mixed with desperate need, as if Seraphina were the sun and he'd been living in darkness his entire life. His hand cupped her cheek with a reverence that should have been reserved for sacred things, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion that sounded nothing like the controlled, gentle tone Katherine had grown to love. "I can't fight this anymore," Julius said, and the words fell like stones into water, creating ripples that would drown everything Katherine had believed in. "I know the ceremony is today. I know Katherine is waiting, but every time I try to think about going through with it, every time I try to imagine marking her instead of you, I feel like I'm betraying my own soul." Katherine pressed her hand against the cold stone wall to steady herself, because the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet like a ship caught in a storm. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Julius loved her. She knew he loved her. She'd felt it in every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every time he'd looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. Seraphina stepped closer to Julius, placing her small hand over his heart in a gesture that looked practiced, deliberate, like a chess move disguised as affection. "Then don't go through with it," Seraphina said softly, and her voice had a strange quality to it, smooth and sweet like honey, but with something underneath that made Katherine's instincts scream warning. "Mark me instead. Choose love over duty. Choose what your heart truly wants." Katherine watched as Julius's expression crumbled into anguish, and for one terrible, hope-filled second, she thought he would step back, thought he would remember, thought he would say no. But then his eyes flashed with that unnatural gold that appeared when an alpha made a life-changing decision, and Katherine knew with horrible certainty what was about to happen. "I choose you," Julius said, and his voice carried the weight of an oath that would reshape everything. "I choose you, Seraphina, and I seal that choice now." He moved with the speed and certainty of a wolf who'd finally stopped fighting his instincts, pulling Seraphina close and tilting her head to expose the curve of her neck, where a mating mark would claim her as his forever. Katherine wanted to scream, wanted to run forward and stop him, wanted to throw herself between them and demand that he look at her, really look at her, and remember who they were supposed to be to each other. But her body had turned to stone, frozen in the alcove like a statue of grief, and all she could do was watch as Julius's performed the ceremonial marking on Seraphina's neck, a gesture meant to be sacred, but one that now seemed born of desperate compulsion rather than true devotion, like a man trying to convince himself that the wrong choice would somehow become right if he committed to it completely. The moment his mark sank into Seraphina's skin, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then it shattered. Katherine felt it before she understood it. A violent snap of magic that cracked through the throne room like lightning splitting open the sky. Julius jerked back from Seraphina as if he'd been burned, his eyes wide with shock and something that looked horrifyingly like clarity returning where there had only been blind obsession seconds before. "What?" he gasped, stumbling backward, one hand pressed to his own neck as if he could feel something breaking inside him. "What did you—" But Katherine didn't wait to hear the rest, because she understood now, with a terrible certainty that felt like drowning. The law of the bond, the ancient magic that governed true mating marks, had activated the moment Julius marked someone who wasn't his destined mate. And that activation had done what it was designed to do, shattered whatever spell or enchantment had been controlling him. Seraphina's face twisted with rage and panic, the sweet mask falling away to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "No!" the Omega hissed, and her voice had lost its honeyed quality, now sharp as broken glass. "No, it should have held. The spell should have—" She didn't finish, because Julius lunged forward and grabbed her by the shoulders, his expression no longer blind with false love, but blazing with fury and betrayal. "You enchanted me," he said, and his voice was barely human now. more wolf than man. You made me. But Katherine couldn't listen anymore. She turned and ran. Her ceremonial gown caught on the stone floor, nearly tripping her, but she hitched it up with trembling hands and kept running. Down the corridor, past startled guards who called after her, through the courtyard where early morning servants stopped their work to stare, and toward the forest that bordered the eastern edge of the castle grounds. Behind her, she heard Julius roar her name. "Katherine!" And the sound was filled with such anguish that for half a second she almost stopped. Almost. But then she remembered the way he'd looked at Seraphina. Remembered the way he'd marked another woman hours before he was supposed to pledge himself to Katherine. Remembered that even if it had been a spell, even if he hadn't been in control, the image was now burned into her mind forever, and she didn't know how to unsee it. So she ran faster, her lungs burning and her heart breaking with every step, while behind her the Alpha King who was supposed to love her realized too late what he'd lost. And ahead of her, the forest opened like a dark mouth, ready to swallow her whole. Chapter 2. The forest had always been a place of whispers and shadows, but as Katherine crashed through the underbrush with her ceremonial gown tearing on thorns and her breath coming in ragged sobs, it felt less like a refuge and more like a living thing that was deciding whether to shelter her or consume her. She didn't stop running until her legs gave out beneath her, sending her stumbling to her knees beside a stream that cut through the trees like a silver vein. The water was cold and clear, and when Katherine finally lifted her head to look at her reflection, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her carefully arranged hair had come loose from its pins, falling in tangled waves around a face that was too pale, too shocked, too broken to belong to someone who'd woken up believing today would be the beginning of forever. Katherine dipped her shaking hands into the stream and splashed water on her face, trying to wash away the tears that wouldn't stop falling, trying to wash away the memory of Julius marking someone else, trying to wash away the feeling that her entire life had been a beautiful lie that had finally revealed its true, ugly face. It didn't work. She sat back on her heels, pressing both hands against her chest as if she could physically hold together the pieces of her heart that felt like they were scattering in every direction. Behind her, the forest rustled with movement, footsteps approaching fast, heavy with purpose, and Katherine's entire body went rigid with terror because she knew that stride. She would know it anywhere, even if she lived 1,000 years and tried desperately to forget. Julius. "Katherine, please." His voice came from somewhere close but not quite visible yet, rough with desperation and something that sounded like barely controlled panic. "Please, just stop. Just let me explain. Let me—" "No," Katherine said. And the word came out stronger than she expected, cutting through the forest like a blade. She pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the way her legs trembled, and turned to face him as he emerged from between two ancient oak trees. He looked terrible. His formal ceremonial clothes were disheveled, his hair wild as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly, and his eyes, those amber eyes she'd loved so much, were haunted with an anguish that might have broken her if she weren't already shattered. But it was the mark on his own neck that made Katherine's stomach lurch with fresh pain, the faint silvery scar that appeared when an alpha marked someone who wasn't their true mate, a permanent reminder that he'd given away something sacred to the wrong person. "Katherine," Julius said again, taking a step toward her with his hands raised as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any moment. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know what she was doing. The spell, it made me believe—" "I know what it made you believe," Katherine interrupted, and her voice cracked on the words despite her best efforts to stay composed. "I saw you. I saw the way you looked at her. I saw you mark her, Julius. And I know—" She had to stop and breathe because the next part hurt too much to say without breaking completely. "I know it wasn't your fault. I know you were enchanted. But knowing that doesn't make the image go away. It doesn't make me unsee it. It doesn't make me forget that on what was supposed to be our day, you gave someone else what was supposed to be mine." Julius flinched as if she'd struck him, and the pain that flashed across his face was so genuine that Katherine almost softened. But then she remembered Seraphina's triumphant expression right before the spell broke, and fury rose up in Catherine's chest like a living thing, hot and wild and desperately needed, because anger was so much easier to hold on to than grief. "How long?" Katherine demanded, taking a step toward him now, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. How long was she enchanting you? Days? Weeks? Months? Julius opened his mouth, closed it, and for a long, terrible moment, he looked like he was trying to remember something that had been deliberately erased from his mind. "I don't know," he finally admitted, and the confession sounded like it was being torn out of him. "I remember meeting her a year ago when she started working in the castle. I remember thinking she was efficient and pleasant, and then there are gaps, moments that feel wrong when I try to recall them, conversations I can't quite remember having, dreams that felt more real than waking." He took another step closer, and this time Katherine didn't move away, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "But I remember you," Julius continued, and his voice dropped to something raw and desperate. "I remember every moment with you, Katherine. Every walk in the gardens, every conversation, every time I looked at you and thought I was the luckiest man alive because somehow, impossibly, the woman I was obligated to marry turned out to be the woman I actually wanted to spend my life with." Katherine felt tears burning hot tracks down her cheeks again, and she hated them. Hated how her body betrayed her by continuing to react to him when her mind was screaming that nothing he said would fix this. "Then why?" she whispered. "If you remember me, if what we had was real, then why did the spell work at all? Why were you vulnerable to it?" It was the question that had been eating at her since she'd fled the throne room, the terrible doubt that maybe, some part of Julius had wanted an escape from their arrangement, even if he'd never consciously admitted it. Julius's expression crumbled, and he sank down onto a fallen log as if his legs could no longer hold him. "Because I was afraid," he said, so quietly that Katherine almost didn't hear him. "Because as much as I loved you, as much as I wanted our future together, there was always this voice in the back of my mind asking what if? What if the only reason we loved each other was because we'd been told we would since before we were born? What if our feelings were just us making the best of an obligation? What if in a world where we weren't promised to each other, we never would have chosen this?" Katherine's breath caught because she'd had those same thoughts. Late at night when she couldn't sleep, she'd wondered the same terrible things. "And Seraphina's magic," Julius continued, his hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles went white. "It must have latched on to that fear, that doubt. It twisted it into certainty that I'd been living a lie, that you weren't my choice, that what I felt for her was somehow more real, because it felt uncontrolled and overwhelming." He looked up at Katherine with eyes that held too much pain to be anything but honest. "But the moment I marked her, the moment the law of the bond activated, it burned away every lie she'd planted in my head, and I knew, with absolute certainty that you are my true mate, not because we were promised, not because of duty, but because my soul recognized yours before we even met." Katherine wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together against the force of his words, trying not to let hope take root when trust had been so thoroughly destroyed. "That's beautiful," she said, and the sarcasm in her voice was thin armor against vulnerability. "Truly. But it doesn't change anything, Julius. You marked her. You gave her the bond that was supposed to be mine. And even if the law broke the spell, even if she can never truly claim you as hers, that mark exists. That betrayal exists. And I don't know how to look at you without seeing it." She turned away from him, staring at the stream again, because looking at his devastated face was too hard. "I need time," Katherine said. "I need space. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not just the woman promised to the Alpha King. And I need to do that somewhere far away from you and this castle and everything that just shattered." "No," Julius said, and the word came out sharp enough to make Katherine turn back to him. He was standing now, and there was something in his posture, not commanding exactly, but absolutely unyielding, that reminded her why he was a king. "I understand you're hurt. I understand you need time. But I'm not letting you just disappear, Katherine. Not when there are enemies who would use your vulnerability against us both." Katherine laughed, and it was a bitter sound that didn't belong in a forest that smelled of pine and fresh water. Enemies? Julius, the only enemy I care about right now is the woman you marked hours before our ceremony. And that woman, Julius said, his voice taking on an edge that was pure alpha now, protective and possessive in a way that would normally make Katherine's wolf respond with equal strength. Used ancient forbidden magic, the kind that draws power from forbidden pacts with entities believed lost to time. Katherine froze, because suddenly Julius's expression made sense. It wasn't just guilt and heartbreak. It was fear. What creatures? She asked slowly. Julius hesitated, and in that hesitation, Katherine saw just how much he'd been trying to protect her from. The veil between our world and the realm of the fated, the spirits and dark things that were banished centuries ago, has been weakening, Julius said. My council has been investigating breaches for months, but we couldn't find the source. Now I think we have our answer. Someone's been deliberately tearing holes in it, and Seraphina's magic came from the other side. Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. And you think? I think she was sent to distract me, Julius finished. To make me vulnerable. To break my bond with you before it could be completed. Because a fractured alliance between the bloodlines is exactly what something ancient and hungry would need to slip through the cracks. The forest suddenly felt much darker, the shadows between the trees no longer empty but watching. Then let your council handle it, Katherine said, even though her voice had lost its certainty. You're the king. You have resources, armies, magic users. You don't need me for that. Julius closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, and before Katherine could retreat, he'd taken her hands in his, holding them with a gentleness that completely contradicted the fierce intensity in his eyes. I don't need you for that, he agreed, but I need you because I love you. Because you're my mate in every way that matters, marked or not, and because if someone was willing to use blood magic to tear us apart, then you being alone and unprotected is exactly what they want. Katherine tried to pull her hands away, but Julius held firm, not trapping her, but anchoring her. Please, he said, and the Alpha King who commanded thousands sounded like he was begging for his life. Come back to the castle, not to the throne room, not to resume the ceremony, just come back where I can keep you safe while we figure out what's happening and how to stop it. 1 week, Katherine. Give me 1 week to prove that what we had was real, and to show you that I will spend the rest of my life making this right. Katherine looked at their joined hands, then up at Julius's face, and saw the man she'd fallen in love with staring back at her with desperate hope warring with grief. She should say no. Should run deeper into the forest and disappear into one of the border territories where no one knew her name. But as much as her heart was broken, as much as her trust had been shattered, there was still a part of her, maybe the stupidest, most stubborn part, that whispered, what if he's telling the truth? 1 week, Katherine heard herself say, and Julius's entire body sagged with relief. But I'm not sharing your rooms, I'm not attending court, and I'm not pretending that everything's fine. If I'm staying, it's to figure out what happened and why, not to play happy couple. Done, Julius said immediately. Whatever you need. However you need it. Just don't run where I can't follow. Katherine finally pulled her hands free and stepped back, needing distance to remember how to breathe. I'm not making any promises, she warned. Not about us. Not about forgiveness. Maybe what the law revealed is real, but maybe it's also too broken to fix. The pain that flashed across Julius's face was so acute that Katherine had to look away. I understand, he said quietly, and I'll prove to you that some things, even when broken, are worth fighting to repair. They walked back toward the castle in silence, with several feet of space between them that felt like miles, and Katherine tried not to notice the way Julius's gaze kept flickering to the trees around them, as if expecting enemies to emerge from every shadow, and tried even harder not to notice the way her traitorous heart still skipped when his shoulder accidentally brushed against hers as they navigated the narrow forest path. Because falling out of love with Julius, she was beginning to realize, might be even more impossible than trusting him again. Chapter 3. The castle felt different when Katherine returned, like a home that had been rearranged while she was gone, and now nothing fit quite right anymore. The servants who passed her in the corridors didn't know how to look at her. Some offered sympathetic glances, others quickly averted their eyes, and a few stared with the kind of morbid curiosity usually reserved for accidents you couldn't help but watch. News traveled fast in a place this size, and Katherine knew without asking that everyone had heard about the ruined ceremony, the enchanted king, and the bride who'd run into the forest, rather than face what should have been the happiest day of her life. Julius had kept his word about giving her space. He'd arranged for her to stay in the guest wing, a beautiful suite of rooms with windows that overlooked the rose gardens, and a private sitting area that smelled faintly of lavender. It was far enough from his chambers that she wouldn't accidentally run into him during vulnerable moments, but close enough that she could feel his presence like a distant heartbeat, constant and unavoidable. Right now, Katherine stood at one of those windows, watching the sunset over gardens that had once felt like a sanctuary and now just reminded her of all the evenings she and Julius had walked there together, talking about everything and nothing, building a foundation of friendship that was supposed to support a lifetime. A soft knock at the door made Katherine turn from the window, her body tensing automatically. "It's Mira," came a familiar voice, and Katherine felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. Mira was the head healer, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair, kind eyes, and a no-nonsense attitude that made even the most stubborn patients do what they were told. "Come in," Katherine called, grateful for company that wasn't Julius and wasn't filled with pity. Mira entered carrying a tray with tea and what looked like honey cakes, and the simple domesticity of it made something tight in Katherine's chest loosen slightly. "You haven't eaten since this morning," Mira said, setting the tray down on the small table near the fireplace. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact delivered with the kind of maternal firmness that made it impossible to argue. "And before you tell me you're not hungry, your body needs fuel even when your heart doesn't want food." Katherine almost smiled. Almost. And moved away from the window to sink into one of the chairs by the fire that Mira had lit without asking. "You know, most people are avoiding me like I'm contagious," Katherine said, accepting the cup of tea Mira handed her. The warmth of it seeped into her palms, anchoring her. "Why aren't you?" Mira settled into the opposite chair with her own cup, and something in her expression shifted to something softer, sadder. "Because 60 years ago, I stood in a ceremony circle waiting for a man who never showed up," Mira said quietly. "He'd been enchanted by someone who wanted him for themselves. And by the time the spell broke, I'd already left. Packed my things and disappeared for 3 years because I couldn't bear to face what I thought was rejection." Katherine's breath caught. "I didn't know." "Not many people do," Mira said, taking a sip of her tea. "By the time I came back and learned the truth, he'd already died in a hunting accident. And I spent the next decade wondering if things might have been different if I'd stayed and fought for what we had, instead of running from what I thought I'd lost." The words settled over Katherine like a blanket that was both comforting and suffocating. "I don't know how to fight for it," Katherine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because even if the enchantment made him mark her, even if none of it was real, he still did it. And I still saw it. And I don't know how to separate the man I love from the image of him choosing someone else." Mira reached across the space between their chairs and covered Katherine's hand with her own, the touch warm and steady. "Then don't," Mira said simply. "Don't try to separate them. Don't try to forget. Don't try to pretend the pain isn't real. Instead, decide if the man Julius has always been to you is worth fighting alongside, even when the road is hard." Katherine looked at their joined hands, then up at Mira's face. "What if I fight and it's still not enough? What if the love was real but the damage is too deep? Then at least you'll know you tried," Mira said. "And you won't spend the rest of your life wondering what if, like I have." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking tea and watching the fire dance. And Katherine felt something she hadn't felt since this morning. Not peace exactly, but maybe the beginning of clarity. She was still angry, still hurt, still broken in ways she didn't know how to name. But maybe, just maybe, she was also strong enough to stay and face it instead of running until she forgot who she used to be. Katherine had just finished her second honey cake, Mira had been right about needing fuel. When another knock came at the door, this one more hesitant than the last. "Yes?" Katherine called, wondering if it was one of the servants bringing fresh linens, or perhaps another well-meaning visitor. The door opened slowly, and Katherine's entire body went rigid when she saw who stood there. Not Julius. Serafina. The Omega looked different than she had this morning. The triumphant, calculated mask was gone, replaced by something that looked almost ashamed. Her neck was wrapped in a silk scarf that didn't quite hide the mark Julius had given her, the mark that should have been Katherine's, and her eyes were red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. Mira stood immediately, positioning herself between Katherine and Serafina with a healer's instinct to protect. "You have no business here," Mira said, her voice carrying a steel edge Katherine had never heard before. "I know," Serafina said, and her voice was small, stripped of the honey sweetness from this morning. "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I need to speak with Katherine. Please, just 5 minutes." Katherine should have said no. Should have had Mira escort this woman out and bar her from ever coming near these rooms again. But there was something in Serafina's expression, genuine fear mixed with desperate regret, that made Katherine curious despite herself. "It's all right, Mira," Katherine said quietly, standing. "I'll hear what she has to say." Mira looked like she wanted to argue, but after a long moment of studying Katherine's face, she nodded slowly. "I'll be right outside," Mira said, giving Serafina a look that promised consequences if anything happened. Then she left, closing the door but not quite all the way, leaving it open just enough that she could intervene if needed. Katherine crossed her arms, creating a physical barrier between herself and the woman who'd tried to steal her future. "You have 5 minutes," Katherine said, "and then I never want to see your face again." Serafina flinched but nodded, stepping further into the room but keeping a respectful distance. "I didn't know," Serafina said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I swear to you, I didn't know what I was doing." "Not really." Katherine raised an eyebrow. "You didn't know you were enchanting the Alpha King? You didn't know you were trying to make him mark you instead of his intended mate?" "I knew I wanted him," Serafina admitted, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I knew I was using magic, but I thought it was just a love spell. Something to make him notice me, to make him see me as more than just another castle worker. I didn't know the magic was coming from something dark, something that was using me as much as I thought I was using it." Katherine's arms tightened around herself, because she wanted to dismiss this as lies, as manipulation, as just another attempt to avoid consequences. But there was something in Serafina's voice, a genuine horror, that rang with uncomfortable truth. "Explain," Katherine said coldly. Serafina wrapped her arms around herself, mirroring Katherine's defensive posture. "I found a book in the old library 6 months ago," Serafina began, her voice shaking. "It was hidden behind other volumes, like someone had deliberately concealed it. The spells inside promised that I could make someone see me, really see me, if I just followed the instructions. And I was so tired of being invisible, so tired of watching everyone else find love while I stayed alone, that I convinced myself it was harmless." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "But every time I cast the spell, every time I whispered the words and burned the herbs it required, I felt something else answering. Something that wasn't just my magic. It was like there was a voice in my head, telling me what to say to Julius, how to stand, when to touch him. And the more I listened, the more I needed to listen, until I wasn't sure anymore which thoughts were mine and which were something else's." Katherine felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "And this morning?" she asked. "When you convinced him to mark you?" Serafina's face crumpled, and she sank down onto the edge of a chair as if her legs could no longer hold her. "This morning I woke up and the voice was screaming at me to finish it, to make him complete the bond before the ceremony could happen. It said that if I succeeded, if I became his marked mate, then I would finally be enough, finally be worthy, finally be loved." She looked up at Katherine with eyes full of devastation. "I didn't realize until after, when the law of the bond broke the enchantment and the voice disappeared, that I'd been turned into a weapon, that something on the other side of the veil had been using my loneliness and my jealousy to tear apart something sacred. Katherine wanted to hate this woman, wanted to hold on to the anger because anger was easier than empathy, but she'd felt loneliness. She'd felt invisible, and if someone had offered her magic that promised to fix it, would she have been strong enough to say no? "Why are you telling me this?" Katherine asked, her voice softer now but still guarded. "Because you deserve the truth," Serafina said, "and because I need you to know that when Julius looks at you, he's seeing clearly for the first time in months. Everything he felt for me was manufactured, twisted, forced. But everything he feels for you? That's real. That's his. And I took 6 months of your life together and poisoned them. And I'm so sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, and Katherine didn't know what to do with it. She wasn't ready to forgive, might never be ready to forgive. But understanding why something happened didn't make it hurt less. It just made the hurt more complicated. "Where is the book now?" Katherine asked, because focusing on practical matters was easier than processing the emotional ones. "Julius's council has it," Serafina said. "They're studying it to figure out what it was and where it came from. They think—" She hesitated, then forced herself to continue. "They think it was deliberately placed for me to find. That whoever or whatever is on the other side of the veil has been watching the castle, looking for vulnerabilities. And I was just convenient." Katherine walked to the window again, needing the distance, needing to look at something other than Serafina's tear-stained face. "What happens to you now?" Katherine asked, though she wasn't sure why she cared. "I'm leaving," Serafina said quietly. "Tonight. The council agreed that as long as I go far away and never use magic again, they won't pursue consequences. They said the enchantment makes me more victim than villain, but—" her voice broke. "But I know what I did. I know I let jealousy make me vulnerable to something dark, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make sure no one else makes the same mistake." Katherine turned from the window, studying the woman who'd nearly destroyed everything. "I can't forgive you," Katherine said, and the honesty felt important. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But I believe you when you say you were manipulated, and I hope that wherever you go, you find a way to forgive yourself, because living with that kind of guilt will destroy you faster than any consequences the council could impose." Serafina stood, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for listening, for not turning me into a monster when I already feel like one." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "He loves you," Serafina said, not turning around. "When the spell broke and I could finally see his face clearly, the first thing I saw was panic. Not anger at me, panic that he'd lost you. Whatever happens between you two, please know that his love for you is the most real thing I've ever seen." Then she left, closing the door softly behind her, and Katherine was alone again with her thoughts and her pain, and the uncomfortable realization that the world was rarely as simple as villains and victims. Mira came back in a moment later, her expression questioning. "Are you all right?" Mira asked gently. Katherine wasn't sure how to answer that, because she was still hurt and angry and confused, but she was also something else now, aware that Julius hadn't chosen to betray her, that his love had been real all along, even when magic made him act otherwise. "I don't know," Katherine admitted, "but I think I'm ready to hear Julius's side. Not to forgive him immediately, not to pretend everything's fine, but to actually listen." Mira smiled, and it was proud and sad at the same time. "Then you're braver than most people ever learn to be," Mira said. And as Katherine finished her tea and watched the last of the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, she made a decision. She would stay the full week she'd promised. She would listen. She would try to understand. And if, at the end of it, her heart was still too broken to repair, at least she'd know she'd tried everything before walking away. Chapter 4. Julius found Katherine in the library 3 days later, and for a moment he just stood in the doorway watching her, afraid that if he moved or spoke, she would disappear like morning mist. She sat curled in one of the large leather chairs near the window, surrounded by books that were stacked haphazardly on the side table. Volumes about ancient magic, the history of the veil, accounts of enchantments and how they worked. She'd apparently been researching, trying to understand what had happened, and something about that made Julius's chest ache with a mixture of love and regret. Because of course Katherine would respond to trauma by seeking knowledge. Of course she would try to make sense of the senseless. It was one of the things he loved most about her. Katherine must have sensed his presence because she looked up from the book she was reading, and their eyes met across the library. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Katherine closed the book slowly and set it aside. "You've been avoiding me," she said. And it wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Julius stepped into the library, closing the door behind him but staying near it, giving her space. "I thought you needed time without me hovering," he admitted. "And I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, you'd run again." Katherine tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Serafina came to see me," she said. Julius went very still, and Katherine saw his hands clench into fists before he deliberately relaxed them. "I didn't know she would do that," Julius said carefully. "If I had, I would have stopped her. You shouldn't have had to face her alone." "I wasn't alone," Katherine said. "Mira was there. And honestly, I think I needed to hear what Serafina had to say. It didn't fix anything, but it clarified things." Julius took a few steps closer, hope and caution warring on his face. "What did she tell you?" Katherine stood, needing to move, needing to not feel trapped in the chair while discussing something this important. She walked to one of the shelves and ran her fingers along the spines of books, not really seeing them. "She told me about the book, about the voice that wasn't hers, about how she thought she was casting a love spell and didn't realize she was opening a door for something dark to manipulate her." Katherine glanced back at Julius. "Is that true? Was she being controlled?" Julius nodded slowly. "The Council's magic users examined both the book and Serafina. There's residual dark magic clinging to her like cobwebs, the kind that comes from the other side of the veil. She was definitely influenced, though how much was the entity's control and how much was her own choice?" He shrugged helplessly. "That's harder to determine. But you believe she didn't fully understand what she was doing," Katherine pressed. "I believe she made a terrible choice driven by loneliness and jealousy," Julius said. "And I believe something ancient and malicious took advantage of that vulnerability. Both things can be true at once." Katherine turned to face him fully, leaning back against the bookshelf. "I've been thinking about that a lot these past few days," she said quietly. "About how we're all vulnerable to something. How none of us are as strong as we pretend to be. How easy it would be for something dark to find our weak spots and exploit them." She paused, gathering her courage for what she needed to say next. "And I've been thinking about what my vulnerability is, what my weak spot would be." Julius took another step closer, drawn to her despite himself. "What is it?" he asked softly. Katherine met his eyes, and the honesty in her gaze made Julius's heart race. "You," she said. "My weak spot is you. The fear that what we have isn't real. That it's just convenience wrapped in destiny, obligation pretending to be choice. That's the lie I would be most vulnerable to believing, because it's the fear I've carried since the beginning." Julius felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. "Katherine, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "Please." He nodded, forcing himself to listen, even though everything in him wanted to cross the distance between them and prove with actions instead of words that what they had was real. "When I saw you mark Serafina," Katherine continued, and her voice shook slightly but didn't break, "it confirmed my deepest fear. It made me believe that you'd finally found something real, something chosen, something that wasn't me. And that hurt worse than anything I've ever felt." Tears were sliding down her cheeks now, but she didn't wipe them away. "But then the law of the bond activated, and the spell broke, and I saw your face when you realized what had happened, and I understood something I'd been too afraid to believe before." "What?" Julius whispered, barely daring to hope. That you love me enough that even magic couldn't make you complete a false bond, Katherine said. The law exists to protect true mates. It only activates when someone tries to force a connection that goes against soul-deep truth, and it activated for you because your soul knew, even when your mind was clouded, that I'm yours and you're mine. Julius couldn't stop himself anymore. He crossed the library in 3 long strides and pulled Katherine into his arms, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had been tilting dangerously for days. Katherine stiffened for just a moment, then melted into the embrace, her arms wrapping around his waist and her face pressing against his chest. "I'm so sorry," Julius said into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry you had to see that. I'm so sorry I was vulnerable enough to be enchanted in the first place. I'm so sorry that my fears gave something dark a way to hurt you." "I'm sorry, too," Katherine said, her words muffled against him. "I'm sorry I ran instead of fighting. I'm sorry I let my own fears make me believe you would choose someone else." They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other, and Julius felt something shift. Not fixed, not healed, but no longer quite as broken. Finally, Katherine pulled back just enough to look up at him, though she didn't leave his arms. "I'm not ready to go through with the ceremony yet," she said, and Julius could see how hard it was for her to be this honest, this vulnerable. "I'm not ready to pretend that everything's fine and we can just pick up where we left off. But I think I'm ready to try, to work on rebuilding what was damaged, to figure out how to trust again." Julius cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "We'll go as slowly as you need," he promised. "I don't care if it takes months or years. I don't care if we have to start completely over. As long as you're willing to try, I'll wait as long as it takes." Katherine leaned into his touch, and Julius saw the moment she made a conscious choice to let herself be vulnerable with him again. "There's something else," Katherine said. "The books I've been reading, they all say the same thing about the veil, that it's been weakening for decades, that the barriers between our world and the realm of the fated are thinning, and that when they finally break completely, things that should stay forgotten will return." Julius's expression darkened, because this was the conversation he'd been dreading. "My council believes the same thing," he admitted, "and they think Seraphina's enchantment was just the beginning. A test to see if they could influence events in our world." "Who is they?" Katherine asked. Julius hesitated, then decided she deserved the full truth. "The Forgotten Court," he said quietly. "Spirits and entities that were banished beyond the veil centuries ago, when our ancestors sealed them away. They've been trapped there ever since, and according to legend, they've spent all that time growing bitter and hungry for revenge." Katherine's face went pale. "And they're trying to come back. They're trying to tear down the veil completely," Julius confirmed. "And apparently they think the best way to do that is to destabilize the strongest alliances in our world, starting with us." Katherine pulled away from his arms, and Julius let her go, watching as she paced the length of the library trying to process this information. "Why us specifically?" she asked. "There are other royal families, other alliances. Why target our bond?" Julius ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by how little they actually knew. "We're not sure yet, but my council thinks it has something to do with our bloodlines. Your family has ancient magic running through it, protective magic that's been passed down for generations, and mine has always been tied to maintaining the veil, keeping watch over the boundaries. Together, our bond would create something stronger than either line alone." Understanding dawned on Katherine's face. "So breaking us apart weakens the veil?" "Yes, and if they succeed in tearing it down completely, then the Forgotten Court returns," Julius finished. "Along with everything else that was sealed away." Katherine sank back into her chair, the weight of this revelation pressing down on her shoulders. "So staying broken, letting my hurt and anger keep us apart, that's exactly what they want," she said quietly. Julius knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in his. "I won't pressure you to forgive me before you're ready, just because there's a larger threat," he said firmly. "Your healing matters more than strategy. But yes, they wanted to tear us apart because divided, we're vulnerable. Together, we're a threat to whatever they're planning. Katherine looked at their joined hands, then up at Julius's face. Then I guess we'll have to heal faster than they expect, she said. And there was steel in her voice now, determination replacing fear. Because I refuse to let ancient spirits dictate my future. Julius felt pride and love surge through him so strongly it was almost painful. There's my fierce mate, he said softly. And this time Katherine didn't flinch at the word mate. We need to talk to your council, Katherine said. I want to see this book Seraphina found. I want to understand what we're facing, and I want to figure out how to repair the veil before these things can break through completely. She stood, pulling Julius up with her, and for the first time since the disastrous ceremony, she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with, strong, determined, ready to face impossible odds. Together, Katherine added, squeezing his hand. We face this together. Julius brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture of reverence and promise. Together, he agreed. And as they left the library side by side, neither of them noticed the way the shadows in the corners seemed to pulse with frustration, or how the temperature dropped just slightly when Katherine voiced her determination to fight back. Because the Forgotten Court had been counting on a broken bond to weaken the veil. And they were very unhappy to discover that their plan might not work after all. Chapter 5. The council chamber was colder than Katherine remembered. Or maybe it was just the subject they were about to discuss that made the air feel sharp and unwelcoming. Julius had called an emergency session. Just the inner circle, the people he trusted most. And Katherine was surprised to discover she was included in that group now. Not as decoration or as the future mate standing silently beside the king, but as an active participant whose insights were valued. It should have made her feel powerful. Instead, it made her acutely aware of how unprepared she was for the reality of what they were facing. Around the large wooden table sat 6 others besides herself and Julius, Mira the healer, Commander Talus who led the castle guard, Elena the master of ancient texts, Dorian who specialized in protective magic, Sophia who served as the spiritual advisor, and Marcus the king's most trusted strategist. The cursed book sat in the center of the table, contained within a circle of protective runes that glowed faintly blue. Elena was the first to speak, her elderly fingers hovering near the book but not quite touching it. This volume shouldn't exist, Elena said, her voice carrying equal parts fascination and horror. The binding technique, the ink used, even the paper itself. All of it dates back to before the sealing, before the veil was erected, which means this book has been hidden somewhere in our castle for at least 300 years, waiting for the right moment to be found. Or the right person, Sophia added, her melodic voice unusually somber. The spells inside aren't just instructions, they're lures. Each one is designed to appeal to a specific vulnerability: loneliness, ambition, grief, fear. Seraphina found a love spell, but there are others. Much worse ones. Katherine leaned forward, studying the book more closely despite the way it made her skin crawl. Can you destroy it? She asked. Dorian shook his head, his usually cheerful face drawn tight with worry. We've tried. Fire won't touch it. Magic slides off it like water off stone. And the one time we attempted a dispelling ritual, the book laughed. He said the last word like he couldn't quite believe it himself. Actual laughter, not metaphorical, like it was mocking our efforts. Because it's not fully in our world anymore, Julius said quietly. Part of it is still connected to the Forgotten Court, still drawing power from the other side of the veil. That's why we can't destroy it. It's already partially existing in a realm where our rules don't apply. Katherine felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then what do we do with it? She asked. We can't let anyone else find it. Commander Talus spoke up, his gruff voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent a lifetime making hard decisions. We keep it contained, keep it guarded, and we use it to learn everything we can about what we're facing. Know your enemy and all that. Except our enemy isn't the book, Marcus pointed out, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the table. The book is just a tool. Our real enemy is whatever's on the other side, using it to destabilize our world. The Forgotten Court, Katherine said, and everyone's attention turned to her. She'd been quiet until now, listening and learning. But there was a question that had been nagging at her since Julius first mentioned the name. Why are they called forgotten if we still remember them? Sophia's expression softened with something like approval. Because we remember the name, but we've forgotten what they actually were, Sophia explained. When the veil was created, part of its magic involved erasing detailed knowledge of the entities being sealed away. Our ancestors believed that remembering them too clearly would make them stronger, would give them a connection back to our world. So they kept the warning, beware the Forgotten Court, but removed the specifics of what we should be afraid of. Which means we're fighting blind, Katherine said, frustration creeping into her voice. Not entirely, Elena interjected, pulling out a separate, much older text from the stack beside her. There are fragments, pieces of knowledge that survived because they were recorded as myth instead of history. And one thing appears consistently across all the surviving accounts. She opened the ancient book to a page marked with a faded ribbon and read aloud, "The forgotten hunger not for conquest, but for belonging. They were cast out, and they remember. They were sealed away, and they rage. But their greatest weapon is not force. It is the ability to show you what you most fear losing, and then offer you a choice. Keep what you love and let the veil stand, or tear it down and reclaim what was taken." The words settled over the room like a shroud. "They make you choose," Katherine said slowly, understanding dawning. "They don't break through by force. They manipulate someone into opening the door for them." "Exactly," Julius said, pride and worry mixing in his expression as he looked at her. That's why Seraphina's enchantment was so dangerous. They were testing to see if they could use her loneliness to create a crack in the veil. And when that didn't fully work, "They'll try something else," Katherine finished. "Something bigger. Something designed to force an impossible choice." Mira, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "They'll come after your bond again," she said, looking between Katherine and Julius with concern. "You've proven you're stronger together than they anticipated, which means they'll escalate. They'll try to force a situation where Katherine has to choose between saving Julius or keeping the veil intact." Katherine's blood ran cold. "Or Julius will have to choose between saving me and protecting the kingdom." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of an inevitable truth. Julius reached for Katherine's hand under the table, lacing his fingers through hers, and she held on tightly, drawing strength from the contact. "Then we don't give them the opportunity," Julius said, his voice carrying royal command even though they were among friends. "We strengthen the veil before they can tear it further. We protect each other, and we refuse to play their game." "How do we strengthen something we don't fully understand?" Dorian asked, though the question was gentle, not challenging. Elena flipped through several pages of the ancient text before stopping on one that showed an intricate diagram of intersecting circles and symbols. "There's a ritual," she said carefully, "a bonding ceremony that predates even the creation of the veil. It's designed to join two bloodlines so completely that their magic becomes one unified force. If Katherine and Julius completed it, their combined power could reinforce the weakest points in the veil, essentially repairing what the Forgotten Court has been slowly unraveling." Katherine felt her heart rate pick up. "The mating ceremony. You're talking about finally completing our bond." "Not just the ceremony," Sophia clarified. "This is older, deeper. It requires both participants to willingly open themselves completely. No barriers, no fears, no doubts. You would literally be sharing souls, and that kind of vulnerability," she trailed off, looking at Katherine with sympathy. "It requires absolute trust." Katherine's hand tightened around Julius's as the implication hit her. She'd spent the past few days learning to trust again, learning to believe that Julius's love was real, but opening herself completely, with no protection, no walls, no safety net, that was terrifying. And the Forgotten Court probably knew it. "How long do we have?" Julius asked, his thumb rubbing soothing circles on the back of Katherine's hand. Marcus consulted several reports in front of him, his expression growing grimmer with each page. The scouts have reported unusual occurrences along the borders. Animals behaving strangely, sudden temperature drops, people reporting dreams that feel more like memories. The veil is thinning faster than we anticipated. I'd say we have a week, maybe 2, before the barriers become weak enough that the Forgotten Court can start pushing through without needing a human to open the door for them. 2 weeks, Katherine echoed, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. Julius turned to her, his expression open and honest and filled with a patience that made her chest ache. "I know this is asking too much," he said quietly, meant only for her, even though everyone could hear. "I know you're still healing from what happened, but if you're not ready, if you need more time, we'll find another way. I won't force you into a bond just because the world is falling apart." Katherine looked at him, really looked, and saw the man who'd held her while she cried in the forest, who'd given her space when she needed it, who'd protected her from consequences and visitors, and anyone who might make her pain worse. She saw the man she'd fallen in love with, the man whose soul the law of the bond had recognized as hers, even when magic tried to convince him otherwise. And she saw the fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with the Forgotten Court, and everything to do with the possibility that she might say no. "I need to think," Katherine said finally, and she saw the flash of disappointment Julius tried to hide. "Not because I don't trust you, but because a decision this big, a bond this permanent, I need to make it for the right reasons. Because I want you, not because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't." Julius brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Take all the time you need," he said. "We'll prepare for the ritual just in case, but the final choice is yours, always." The meeting continued for another hour, discussing logistics and protections and contingency plans, but Katherine only half listened, because her mind was racing with a terrible realization. The Forgotten Court was clever. They'd created a situation where Katherine's healing and the world's safety were on opposing timelines. If she rushed into the bond before she was ready, she'd be making the same mistake as before, choosing obligation over genuine feeling, and that kind of false foundation would crumble eventually. But if she took the time she actually needed to heal, the veil might fall before she got there. It was an impossible choice designed to break her either way, and she had less than 2 weeks to figure out how to refuse to break. Chapter 6. Katherine spent the next 3 days in a state of restless uncertainty that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing she'd eventually have to jump but unable to make her feet move. She wandered the castle during hours when most people were sleeping, finding comfort in the quiet darkness and the way moonlight filtered through stained glass windows to paint the floors in shifting colors. It was during one of these midnight walks that she discovered Julius did the same thing. Apparently, neither of them could sleep with the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on their chests. They'd established an unspoken routine. When they encountered each other in the corridors, they would walk together in comfortable silence, not touching, but close enough that Katherine could feel the warmth radiating from Julius's presence like a promise she wasn't quite ready to accept. On the 3rd night, Katherine found herself in the castle's observatory, a circular room at the top of the east tower with windows that offered a view of the entire kingdom stretching out beneath the stars. She was so absorbed in watching the constellations that she didn't hear Julius enter until he spoke. "My mother used to bring me here when I was young," Julius said softly, and Katherine turned to find him standing near the doorway, as if waiting for permission to come closer. "Whenever I was overwhelmed by the weight of being crown prince, she'd point to the stars and remind me that even the brightest lights in the sky were just doing what they were meant to do, and that was enough." Katherine smiled despite herself. "That's surprisingly philosophical for astronomy." "She was a surprisingly philosophical woman," Julius said, finally stepping into the room. "You would have liked her. She had this way of making the most complicated problems feel manageable just by breaking them down into smaller pieces." "What would she say about our situation?" Katherine asked, genuinely curious. Julius moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "She'd probably say that we're trying to solve too many things at once," he said thoughtfully. "The Forgotten Court, the weakening veil, the rushed timeline. The broken trust. We're treating them like one massive problem when really there's several smaller ones that we could tackle individually. Katherine turned to look at him, seeing the intelligence and care in his expression that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. "So, how do we break them apart?" she asked. Julius was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the starlit landscape as if looking for answers written in the darkness. "We stop letting fear make our decisions," he said finally. "The Forgotten Court wants us afraid of running out of time, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid that if we don't act immediately, everything will fall apart. But fear makes us sloppy. It makes us rush into solutions that might cause more problems than they solve." Katherine felt something shift in her chest, like a door she'd been holding closed was finally beginning to open. "You're saying we shouldn't complete the bonding ritual just because we're running out of time," she said slowly. "I'm saying we should only complete it if and when you're genuinely ready," Julius corrected. "And in the meantime, we find other ways to strengthen the veil. We stop playing by their rules and start making our own." Katherine felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were good tears this time, relieved tears, because Julius was giving her exactly what she needed. Permission to choose based on what felt right instead of what felt urgent. "How are you so patient?" she whispered. "How are you not angry that I can't just forgive and move on and give you what you need to protect the kingdom?" Julius turned to face her fully, and the expression on his face was so tender it made Katherine's breath catch. "Because I love you more than I love the kingdom," he said simply. "And if the price of saving the world is forcing you into a bond before you're ready, then the world can find another way to save itself. You matter more." Katherine let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "That's a terrible thing for a king to say." "Good thing I'm talking to you as Julius right now, not as the king," he replied with a small smile. "The king makes sacrifices for the greater good. But Julius? Julius refuses to sacrifice the woman he loves just because it's convenient." Katherine closed the remaining distance between them and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his chest and feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried the weight of everything she couldn't quite articulate yet. Julius held her carefully, like she was something precious that might break if he held too tightly. "For what?" he asked softly. "For loving me enough to wait," Katherine said. "For not making this an ultimatum. For choosing me over convenience." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other in starlight, and Katherine felt something she hadn't felt since before the disastrous ceremony. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other in a way that was even stronger than before. It was Julius who finally broke the comfortable silence with a question that surprised her. "Will you tell me about your childhood?" he asked. "I realized the other day that even though we've spent 6 months getting to know each other, I know very little about who you were before we met. What made you into the woman standing here right now?" Katherine pulled back slightly to look up at him, surprised by the request, but also touched by it. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I want to understand you," Julius said. "Not just the version of you that exists in the present, but all the experiences and moments and choices that shaped you. I want to know what you were like as a child, what your dreams were, what scared you, what made you laugh." Katherine felt her heart swell with an emotion she couldn't quite name, something bigger than love, more fundamental than trust, like recognition at a soul-deep level. "All right," she said, taking his hand and leading him to sit on the cushioned bench that lined one wall of the observatory. "But only if you share yours too. Fair trade." Julius smiled, and it was the first genuinely happy expression Katherine had seen on his face since everything fell apart. "Deal." So they sat together as the moon crossed the sky, trading stories and memories and pieces of themselves they'd never shared before. Katherine told him about growing up in a house full of siblings where chaos was the default setting, about learning to find quiet moments in hidden corners with books as her companions, about the pressure of being from an important bloodline but never feeling quite important enough herself. Julius told her about the loneliness of being an only child, raised in a castle full of people who saw him as the future king instead of just a boy who wanted friends. about sneaking out to the village to play with children who didn't know his title, about the weight of his father's expectations, and his mother's gentle encouragement to define success on his own terms. And somewhere in the sharing, something fundamental shifted between them. Because they weren't just the Alpha King and his intended mate anymore. They were two people who'd both spent their lives trying to figure out where they fit, who'd both felt the pressure of destiny, and who'd both discovered that choosing each other had been the first real choice either of them had made in a long time. When the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Katherine realized she'd been holding Julius's hand for hours without even noticing, and that the weight she'd been carrying since the ceremony felt lighter somehow. Not gone. She wasn't healed yet, wasn't ready yet. But lighter. "Julius?" she said softly. I think I'm going to be okay," Katherine said, and she was surprised to discover she meant it. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually. "We're going to be okay." Julius lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I never doubted it," he said. And as they watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, neither of them noticed the shadow that flickered at the edge of the observatory, or the way the temperature dropped just slightly as something ancient and hungry realized its carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel. The forgotten court had counted on fear and rushing and desperation. They hadn't counted on patience, trust, and love that refused to be manipulated. And they were about to discover that underestimating Katherine and Julius had been their first, and possibly fatal, mistake. Chapter 7. The attack came on the 5th day, swift and unexpected, and absolutely terrifying in its precision. Katherine was in the castle gardens that afternoon, enjoying the unseasonably warm weather and the way sunlight filtered through the leaves of the ancient oak trees. Mira had suggested fresh air and gentle exercise would help with the restless energy that came from too much thinking and not enough action, and Katherine had to admit the older woman was right. She'd been examining a rose bush, trying to remember the name Julius had taught her for this particular variety with its deep purple blooms, when the world suddenly tilted sideways. Not physically. The ground didn't move beneath her feet. The trees didn't sway. But reality itself seemed to shimmer like heat waves on a summer road, and Katherine felt a pulling sensation in her chest, as if something invisible had wrapped around her heart and yanked. She gasped, stumbling backward, and that's when she saw it. A crack in the air itself. It started as a thin black line hovering above the garden path, no wider than a blade of grass. But as Katherine watched in horrified fascination, it began to spread. Slowly at first, then faster, spiderwebbing outward like glass breaking in slow motion. And from the other side of the crack came whispers. Dozens of voices overlapping, speaking in languages Katherine didn't recognize, but somehow understood anyway. They promised things: safety, belonging, power, revenge, love, everything a person could want if they would just reach out and touch the crack, widen it, let the voices through. Katherine took another step backward, her heart hammering in her chest, and opened her mouth to scream for help. But before she could make a sound, the crack pulsed with dark light, and something reached through. Not a hand. Not exactly. It was more like living shadow given form, cold and ancient and hungry, and it wrapped around Katherine's wrist with a grip that burned like ice. She did scream then, finally, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the gardens and brought guards running from every direction. But the shadow was faster. An unseen force drew Katherine forward with irresistible power, guiding her toward the crack that now expanded into a portal-like opening. A tear in reality itself that opened onto a place of darkness and whispers, and things that should have stayed forgotten. Katherine dug her heels into the ground, tried to pull away, but she might as well have been trying to fight a hurricane. The shadow was dragging her inexorably toward the opening, and she could feel the pull of it now, a horrible sucking sensation like she was being pulled underwater, drowning in air. "Julius!" she screamed, because if she was going to die or disappear or be dragged into whatever nightmare lay beyond the veil, she wanted his name to be the last thing she said. And then he was there. Julius came running from the direction of the castle, moving faster than Katherine had ever seen him move, his eyes blazing with golden light that meant his wolf was rising to the surface. Behind him ran Commander Talus and several guards, but Julius reached her first, grabbing Catherine's other arm and pulling in the opposite direction. For a moment, Katherine felt like she was being torn in half, Julius pulling one way, the shadow pulling the other, and her body caught between two impossible forces. "Don't let go!" Julius shouted, his voice rough with desperation and command. "Katherine, hold on to me and don't let go." "I'm trying," Katherine gasped, her fingers digging into Julius's arm hard enough to leave marks. The crack widened further, and now Katherine could see what lay beyond it. A landscape of gray mist and twisted trees, a sky with no sun or stars, and figures moving in the distance that were shaped almost, but not quite, like people. The Forgotten Courts realm. She was looking at the place beyond the veil, the prison that had held these entities for 3 centuries, and they were trying to pull her through. "Why me?" Katherine cried, more to herself than anyone else. "Why are they targeting me?" "Because you're the key," came a new voice, and Katherine turned her head enough to see Dorian running toward them with his hands already glowing with protective magic. "Your bloodline. It's one of the original families that created the veil. They need you to open it from this side." Horror crashed over Katherine like a wave. She wasn't just a target because of her bond with Julius. She was a target because her blood literally held the power to undo what her ancestors had created. The shadow around her wrist tightened, burning colder, and Katherine felt her strength beginning to fail. She was losing this tug of war, being pulled inch by inch toward the crack despite Julius's desperate grip. "I can't hold on," Katherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Julius, I can't—" "Yes, you can," Julius said fiercely. And suddenly he was right there, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing with determination and love and absolute refusal to let her go. "You're the strongest person I know, Katherine. You survived heartbreak. You survived betrayal. You survived your worst fear coming true, and you're still here, still fighting. So fight now. Fight for us. Fight for the future we haven't built yet." Katherine wanted to believe him, wanted to find that strength he claimed to see in her. But the pull was so strong, and she was so tired, and the whispers from beyond the crack were promising that if she just let go, if she just stopped fighting, everything would stop hurting. She felt her fingers beginning to slip from Julius's arm, felt the shadow pulling her forward another few inches, felt Julius's grip tighten to the point of pain, refusing to release her even as she was being torn away. And then Dorian reached them, slamming his glowing hands against the shadow tendril, and magical light exploded outward in a wave of pure force. The shadow shrieked, actually shrieked with a sound like breaking glass and dying animals, and released Katherine so suddenly that she and Julius both went tumbling backward, hitting the ground in a tangle of limbs. For a moment, Katherine couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only lie there with Julius's arms wrapped around her and her face pressed against his chest, while her heart tried to remember its normal rhythm. "Close it," Commander Talus was shouting. "Close the breach before anything else comes through." Dorian and 2 other magic users Katherine didn't recognize formed a triangle around the crack, their hands weaving patterns in the air that left trails of light behind. They chanted words in a language that hurt to hear, old words that tasted like copper and felt like power, and slowly, so slowly, the crack began to seal. The whispers grew louder, angrier, desperate, and Katherine saw shapes pressing against the other side of the tear as if trying to force their way through before it closed completely. But Dorian's magic held, and after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the crack snapped shut with a sound like thunder, leaving only unmarked air where a doorway to another realm had been. The sudden absence of danger felt almost as disorienting as its presence had been. Katherine lay in Julius's arms, shaking uncontrollably, while he held her and murmured reassurances that she couldn't quite process yet. "You're safe," he kept saying. "You're safe. I've got you. They can't have you. You're safe." Katherine wanted to believe him, but her wrist still burned where the shadow had grabbed her. And when she finally gathered the courage to look, she saw a mark. Not the kind of mark that would fade with time. This one was black as midnight, spreading across her skin like frost on a window, and it pulsed with a faint rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. "What is that?" Katherine whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. Dorian knelt beside them, his expression grim as he examined the mark without touching it. "It's a tether," he said quietly. "They marked you before we broke their hold, which means they can find her again." Julius finished, his arms tightening around Katherine protectively. "They can track her, target her, try to pull her through again." Katherine felt panic rising in her throat like bile. "Can you remove it?" she asked desperately. "Can you break the tether?" Dorian hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. "I don't know," he admitted. "This is ancient magic, older than anything I've studied. I'll need time to research, to consult with other magic users, to—" "We don't have time," Julius interrupted, and his voice carried the weight of terrible certainty. "If they marked her, they'll try again soon. Probably within days, maybe hours. They'll keep trying to drag her through until they succeed, or until we find a way to stop them permanently. Then we complete the bonding ritual," Katherine said, the decision crystallizing in her mind with sudden clarity. "You said joining our bloodlines would strengthen the veil, would repair what they've been unraveling. So we do it. Now, before they can try again." Julius pulled back enough to look at her face, searching her expression for something. "Katherine, you're not ready. I'm terrified," Katherine interrupted. "I'm hurt, and still healing, and nowhere near where I wanted to be before making this choice. But I'm also not stupid. If the alternative is being dragged into that place," she gestured toward where the crack had been, "then I'll take the bond. At least with you, I know I'm choosing something real." Julius held her face in his hands, and Katherine could see through his eyes, the desire to protect her battling with the certainty that she was right. "Are you absolutely sure?" he asked. "Because once we complete this ritual, there's no undoing it. Our souls will be bound together permanently. If you have any doubts at all—" "My only doubt," Katherine said, surprised by how steady her voice had become, "is whether we can complete the ritual before they try to take me again. So unless you're having second thoughts about binding yourself to someone as complicated and damaged as me—" Julius kissed her. It was fierce and desperate, and tasted like fear and love and promises neither of them knew if they could keep. But when he finally pulled back, his eyes were blazing with determination. "All right," he said. "We'll do the ritual. Tonight. Elena said we'd need witnesses and specific preparations. Then we gather them now," Katherine said. "Whatever needs to happen, we make it happen as fast as possible, because I refuse to let those things decide my fate." Julius helped her to her feet, and Katherine swayed slightly, still shaky from the attack. But she forced herself to stand straight, to look strong even though everything in her wanted to collapse and hide. Because the Forgotten Court had made a mistake. They'd tried to make her helpless, tried to make her prey, tried to convince her that she was just a pawn in a game she didn't understand. But instead, they'd given her clarity, and by the time the sun set tonight, Katherine was going to be bound to Julius in a way that would make her untouchable. At least that's what she told herself as they walked back to the castle with guards surrounding them on all sides, her wrist burning with a mark that promised the Forgotten Court wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 8. The ritual chamber was in the oldest part of the castle, deep underground where the stones still remembered the age before kingdoms and crowns, when magic was the only law that mattered. Katherine had never been here before. Few people had. And as she descended the spiral staircase with Elena leading the way, and Mira walking supportively beside her, she felt like she was traveling backward through time itself. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying a scent of earth and old magic that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The walls were carved with symbols Katherine didn't recognize, flowing patterns that seemed to shift and move in her peripheral vision, and the torches that lit their path burned with blue flame that cast strange shadows. The chamber was built by the original bloodline families, Elena explained as they walked, her elderly voice echoing off the stone. Before the veil was created, this was a place of power where magic flowed freely between worlds. After the sealing, It became a sanctuary, the one place where the old rituals could still be performed because the foundation itself remembers what magic is supposed to feel like. Catherine's wrist throbbed where the shadow mark pulsed, reminding her with every heartbeat that something dark and ancient had claimed her as a target. She flexed her fingers, trying to ignore the discomfort, but Mira noticed. "How's the pain?" Mira asked quietly. "Manageable?" Katherine lied, because admitting how much it hurt would mean admitting how scared she actually was. Mira gave her a look that said she saw right through the lie, but chose not to push. They reached the bottom of the stairs and emerged into a circular chamber that took Catherine's breath away. The room was enormous, with a domed ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness above. The floor was made of smooth black stone inlaid with silver symbols that formed an intricate pattern, the same pattern Katherine recognized from Elena's ancient text. Candles surrounded the space in concentric circles, hundreds of them, their flames flickering in a breeze that shouldn't exist this far underground. And in the center stood Julius. He'd changed into ceremonial robes, deep blue embroidered with gold thread that caught the candlelight, and his hair was unbound, falling to his shoulders in waves that softened the sharp angles of his face. When he saw Katherine, his expression shifted from tense anticipation to something softer, more vulnerable. Love mixed with fear, mixed with hope. Catherine's heart squeezed painfully in her chest, because this was happening. This was real. In a matter of hours, she would be bound to this man in a way that transcended even the traditional mating bond, in a way that would merge their souls completely. And she was absolutely terrified. The rest of the council members were already present, standing in positions around the circle that Elena had apparently assigned based on their specific magical strengths. Dorian near the north point, Sophia at the south, Commander Talus at the east, and Marcus at the west. Each held a candle of their own, larger than the others, and their expressions were solemn with the weight of what they were about to witness. Elena guided Katherine to stand opposite Julius across the circle, then took her own position outside the pattern. "The ritual is simple in structure, but profound in consequence," Elena began, her voice taking on a formal cadence. "It requires complete honesty from both participants, absolute willingness, and the courage to open yourselves without protection or barriers. If either of you enters this bond with deception in your heart, the magic will reject you, and the consequences will be severe." Katherine swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "Define severe," she managed to ask. "Death," Elena said bluntly. "Or worse, a fractured soul that can never heal. The magic demands truth because it's creating something that will last beyond lifetimes. It won't tolerate lies." Julius's eyes met Catherine's across the circle, and she saw her own fear reflected back at her. "We can stop this," Julius said quietly, speaking directly to her even though everyone could hear. "If you're not ready, if there's any doubt, we stop right now and find another way." Katherine wanted to say yes. Wanted to run back up those stairs and buy herself more time to heal, more time to be sure, more time to convince herself that this wasn't just fear making decisions for her. But then her wrist pulsed again with dark magic that didn't belong to her, and she remembered the feeling of being dragged toward that crack in reality, remembered the whispers promising terrible things, remembered how close she'd come to disappearing forever. "I'm ready," Katherine said, and she only shook a little. "Maybe not perfectly ready, maybe not healed the way I wanted to be, but ready enough, because the alternative is worse." Julius's expression twisted with something that looked like guilt. "I hate that you're doing this because you feel forced." "I'm not," Katherine interrupted, surprised to discover she meant it. "I'm doing this because even though I'm scared and hurt and still figuring out how to trust again, I know with absolute certainty that I want a future with you. The Forgotten Court didn't create that feeling. They just accelerated the timeline. So yes, I'm ready. Are you?" Julius's answering smile was small but genuine. "I've been ready since the moment I met you," he said. "I'm just sorry it took a crisis to get us here." Elena cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to the ritual. "If you're both certain, then we begin," she said. "Julius, as the one who carries the Veilkeeper bloodline, you speak first. Open your heart completely, hide nothing, and tell Katherine why you choose this bond." Julius took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the chamber with the kind of raw honesty that made Katherine's chest ache. "I choose this bond because Katherine is the first person who made me feel like being Julius mattered more than being the Alpha King," he said. "Because she laughs at my terrible jokes and challenges me when I'm being stubborn and sees through all the masks I wear for everyone else. Because even when I hurt her, even when I marked someone else while under enchantment, she found the courage to come back and try again instead of letting pain make her bitter." He paused, his eyes never leaving Katherine's face. "I choose this bond because my soul recognized hers before my mind caught up. And because loving her has made me a better person. Better king, better man, better wolf. And because if I only get one person to walk through life with, I want it to be her. Even on the hard days. Even when we're both broken. Even when everything falls apart." His voice dropped to something quieter, more intimate. "I choose Katherine because she's my home. And I'm hers. And that's worth protecting with everything I am." Tears were streaming down Katherine's face, but they were good tears this time. Healing tears, because every word Julius spoke was dissolving another piece of the hurt she'd been carrying. "Katherine," Elena said gently, "your turn. Speak your truth." Katherine wiped at her tears with shaking hands and tried to find words big enough to hold everything she was feeling. "I choose this bond because Julius is the first person who made me believe I deserved to be chosen," Katherine said, her voice wavering but growing stronger with each word. "Not because of my bloodline or my family name, but because of who I actually am. Because he sees all my flaws and insecurities and broken pieces and somehow still thinks I'm worth fighting for." She had to pause to breathe, to steady herself, because this next part was harder. "I choose this bond even though I'm still hurt. Even though part of me is still healing from watching him mark someone else. Because I understand now that love isn't about being perfect or having everything figured out before you commit. It's about choosing to build something together, even when it's scary and uncertain, and you have no guarantee it'll work out the way you hope." Katherine's gaze locked with Julius's, and she let him see every vulnerable, frightened, hopeful part of her. "I choose Julius because he waited. Because he gave me space when I needed it and showed up when I was ready. Because his love is patient and kind and fierce all at once. And because even though the Forgotten Court tried to tear us apart, what they actually did was show me how strong our foundation really is." Her voice softened to nearly a whisper. "I choose this bond because Julius is my person, the one I want beside me through everything. And because choosing him feels like coming home to a place I didn't know I'd been searching for my whole life." The air in the chamber seemed to thicken, to pulse, as if the magic itself was listening and approving of what it heard. Elena stepped into the circle, carrying a small ceremonial knife that looked ancient and well used. "The bond requires blood," she explained, "because blood carries memory and magic and truth. You'll each offer yours freely, mix them together, and drink from the shared cup. When your blood mingles, your souls will begin to merge. It will be uncomfortable, possibly painful, but it won't last long. And when it's complete, you'll be bound in a way that transcends death itself." Katherine's heart was racing so fast she felt lightheaded, but she nodded. Julius stepped forward to the center of the circle, and Katherine did the same, until they stood face to face with barely a foot of space between them. Elena handed Julius the knife first. Without hesitation, Julius performed the ritual gesture, touching the ceremonial instrument to his palm, and Katherine watched as the symbol of their commitment appeared against his skin. He held his hand over a silver chalice that Sophia had placed between them, letting several drops fall into the empty cup. Then Elena handed the knife to Katherine. Katherine's hand shook slightly as she took it, and for just a moment she hesitated, because this was it, the point of no return, the choice that would reshape her entire existence. But then she looked at Julius, saw the absolute trust in his eyes, and felt something settle into certainty inside her chest. Katherine mirrored the gesture, completing the ritual exchange, and watched as her essence merged with Julius's within the sacred vessel. The moment their blood touched, the candles flared brighter, and the symbols on the floor began to glow. Elena lifted the chalice, swirling it gently to mix their blood, and Katherine saw that the liquid inside was no longer red, but silver, the color of moonlight and magic and ancient promises. "Drink," Elena said, handing the chalice to Julius first, "and complete the bond that began long before either of you were born." Julius raised the chalice to his lips and drank deeply, his eyes never leaving Katherine's face. Then he passed the cup to her. Katherine's hands trembled as she accepted it, but she didn't hesitate. She brought the chalice to her lips and drank, tasting copper and magic and something indefinable that felt like coming home and leaping off a cliff simultaneously. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Heat exploded through Katherine's chest, spreading outward in waves that made her gasp. She felt Julius's presence suddenly, not just seeing him standing there, but feeling him as if he was somehow inside her skin, his emotions mixing with hers until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. She felt his love for her, deep and fierce and absolute. Felt his fear that she would regret this choice. Felt his determination to protect her from anything that tried to harm her. Felt his soul reaching for hers like two halves of something that had been torn apart and was finally being made whole. And he must have been feeling her too, because his eyes went wide with wonder and pain and joy all mixed together. The magic built and built, swirling around them like a storm, and Katherine felt something fundamental shifting inside her, her soul stretching, expanding, making room for Julius to exist there permanently. It hurt. It was beautiful. It was terrifying and perfect and absolutely overwhelming. And then, just when Katherine thought she might shatter from the intensity of it, the magic settled. The candles returned to normal. The glowing symbols faded. The overwhelming sensation of Julius inside her chest eased to something more manageable. Still present, still constant, but no longer threatening to consume her. Katherine swayed on her feet, and Julius caught her immediately, pulling her against his chest. "Are you okay?" he asked urgently, his hands running over her shoulders, her arms, her face, checking for damage. "I don't know," Katherine admitted, because everything felt different now, changed. She could still sense Julius somehow, feel his heartbeat echoing in her chest alongside her own, feel his worry for her mixing with her disorientation. "The bond is complete," Elena said, and she sounded relieved. "Your souls are now joined. You're no longer just mates. You're bonded in a way that makes you functionally two parts of one whole." Katherine looked up at Julius and saw her own wonder reflected back at her. "I can feel you," she whispered. "I can feel you too," Julius said, and his voice was full of awe. "Your fear, your relief. Your—" He paused, tilting his head slightly. "Your hunger? Did you eat dinner?" Despite everything, Katherine laughed, because of course the first emotion he'd notice was something completely mundane. "No, I was too nervous." "Then we're getting you food immediately after this," Julius said firmly, "because now your hunger is my hunger, and I refuse to go to bed on an empty stomach." The absurdity of discussing food in the middle of an ancient ritual chamber broke the tension, and Katherine felt some of the fear she'd been carrying finally release its grip. Mira was already moving forward with bandages for their hands, and the council members were relaxing from their formal positions, smiling with relief that the ritual had worked without incident. But Katherine's relief was short-lived, because the moment she tried to step away from Julius, her wrist exploded with pain so intense she cried out and nearly collapsed. The shadow mark was writhing on her skin now, no longer just pulsing, but actively moving like a living thing, spreading further up her arm in black tendrils that burned like ice. "What's happening?" Katherine gasped, clutching her wrist. Dorian rushed forward, his hands already glowing with diagnostic magic, but when he touched near the mark, he jerked back as if burned. "The Forgotten Court felt the bond complete," Dorian said, his expression grim. "And they're not happy about it." The mark pulsed one more time, hard and painful. And then Katherine felt it, a pulling sensation identical to what she'd experienced in the garden, except now it was 10 times stronger. They were trying to drag her through the veil again, and this time they weren't being subtle about it. Katherine felt her knees buckle as the pulling intensified, felt reality start to shimmer around her like it had in the garden, and panic exploded in her chest. "No," she gasped. "Not now. We just completed the ritual. It's supposed to protect—" "Julius, hold her!" Elena shouted. "The bond is too new. It hasn't fully settled yet. They're trying to pull her through before it can anchor." Julius wrapped his arms around Katherine, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. But it wasn't enough. She could feel the veil tearing open behind her, could hear the whispers growing louder, could sense the cold darkness reaching for her with hungry intent. "Don't let go," Katherine begged, even though she could feel her body being pulled backward despite Julius's grip. "Please, Julius, don't let go." "Never," Julius swore. But Katherine could see the strain on his face, could feel through their new bond how much effort it was taking him to hold her. The pulling intensified to something unbearable, and Katherine screamed as she felt herself being torn from Julius's arms despite everything. And then everything went dark. Chapter 9. Katherine woke to cold. Not the normal kind of cold that came from winter or wind, but an invasive, bone-deep cold that felt like loneliness given physical form. She sat up slowly, her head spinning, and tried to make sense of where she was. Gray mist swirled around her in thick clouds that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The ground beneath her was hard and smooth like polished stone, but when she touched it, it felt wrong somehow. Too perfect, too cold, like something pretending to be real without understanding what real actually meant. And the sky, there was no sky. Just more mist stretching upward into nothing. Katherine's heart sank as the terrible truth settled over her. She was beyond the veil. The forgotten court had succeeded in dragging her through. Panic rose in her throat like bile, but Katherine forced it down because panicking wouldn't help. She needed to think, needed to figure out where she was and how to get back, and Julius. The thought of him hit her like a physical blow, and Katherine instinctively reached for the bond they'd just completed, searching for the feeling of his presence inside her chest, and found nothing. The bond was there. She could sense it, like a thread connecting her to something distant. But it was muffled, dampened, as if she was trying to hear someone calling from underwater. She could feel that Julius was alive, could sense his panic and fury in waves that matched her own, but she couldn't reach him, couldn't let him know she was okay. Well, relatively okay. Katherine pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the way her legs trembled, and tried to assess her situation practically. She was wearing the ceremonial robes she'd put on for the ritual. Her hand still stung from where she'd cut her palm, though someone, probably Mira, had bandaged it before she'd been pulled through. And her wrist. Katherine looked down at the shadow mark and felt her stomach turn. It had stopped spreading, but it was darker now, more solid, like it had completed whatever transformation it needed to anchor her in this place. "Welcome, Katherine of the Bloodline." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, sliding through the mist like oil on water. Katherine spun around, searching for the speaker, but saw only shapes moving in the gray, humanoid figures that stayed just far enough away to be indistinct. "Who are you?" Katherine demanded, proud that her voice came out steady despite the fear coursing through her. "What do you want?" A figure emerged from the mist ahead of her, tall and elegant, with features that were almost human but not quite right. Its eyes were too large, its fingers too long, its movements too fluid to belong to anything that had ever been truly alive. "We are the Forgotten," the figure said, and its voice echoed like it was speaking through multiple mouths at once. "Those your ancestors cast out. Those who were sealed beyond the veil and left to wither in this place of nothing." The figure tilted its head, studying Katherine with curiosity that felt wrong. "And we want what was stolen from us centuries ago. Passage back to the living world. Freedom from this prison. Revenge against those who banished us." Katherine's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I won't help you destroy the veil," she said flatly. "If that's why you brought me here, you're wasting your time." The figure laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Help us?" "Oh no, child. You misunderstand. We don't need your cooperation." It gestured with one too long hand, and suddenly the mist parted to reveal a scene that made Catherine's breath stop in her throat. Julius. She could see him as clearly as if she were standing in front of him, though she knew somehow that this was a vision, not reality. He was in the ritual chamber still, surrounded by the council, and his face was twisted with anguish and fury as Dorian and Elena worked frantically over empty air, presumably trying to open a doorway to bring her back. "Your maid is quite devoted," the forgotten figure said with something like amusement. "Even now he searches for ways to reach you, to tear down the barriers between worlds and drag you back to safety." Catherine's heart clenched painfully. "Let me go back to him," she said, hating how close to begging she sounded. "Please. I'll do anything." "Anything?" the figure interrupted, and now there was interest in its voice. "How interesting. Because there is something you can do." It moved closer, and Katherine fought the urge to step back. "The veil is ancient magic, created by bloodlines joining together in sacrifice," the figure explained. "It can only be truly broken by one of those same bloodlines choosing to open it from the inside. We tried using the Omega to fracture your bond with the Alpha King because divided bloodlines weaken the barrier, but you proved more resilient than expected." The figure smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing Katherine had ever seen. Too wide, too many teeth, like something mimicking human expression without understanding it. But now you're here, beyond the veil, carrying the fresh magic of a completed bond that connects you to both sides of the barrier. If you were to willingly tear open the veil from this side while your mate tears it from his side, you would create a permanent opening that we could use to return. Horror washed over Katherine in cold waves. "You want me to help Julius rescue me, and use that rescue as a doorway to escape," she said slowly. "Precisely!" The figure clapped its hands together with delight. "The Alpha King's love for you is predictable. He will find a way to reach you, we have no doubt. And when he does, when he tears through the veil with all the power of his bloodline and desperate love, you simply need to widen the opening from your side. Two bloodlines working in concert, just as the original barrier required. Poetic, yes." Catherine's mind raced, searching for options, for ways out of this impossible situation. "And if I refuse?" she asked. The figure's smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and ancient and absolutely merciless. "Then you remain here," it said simply. "Forever. Watching your mate age and die through visions will graciously provide. Existing in this place of nothing while everyone you love moves on without you. Slowly forgetting who you were until even your own name becomes uncertain." Katherine felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Julius would never forgive me if I helped you escape," she said quietly, "even to save myself." "Perhaps," the figure agreed, "but he also won't survive losing you. We've studied him carefully, watched him for months through Seraphina's enchantment. His love for you is absolute. If you stay trapped here, if he cannot rescue you, it will destroy him piece by piece. And we're willing to wait as long as necessary to watch that destruction unfold." It leaned closer, its two large eyes boring into Catherine's. "So you have a choice, Katherine of the bloodline. Help us escape and return to your mate, accepting the guilt of unleashing the forgotten court on the world, but at least surviving together. Or refuse and condemn both yourself and Julius to different but equally devastating endings." The figure stepped back, and the mist swirled around it like living smoke. "We'll give you time to consider," it said. "After all, we have nothing but time here. Though I wonder, how long can your mate hold on to hope before despair takes him?" Then the figure disappeared back into the gray, leaving Katherine alone with impossible choices and the distant, muffled feeling of Julius's anguish bleeding through their dampened bond. Katherine sank to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest, and finally let herself cry, because she was trapped in a nightmare realm with only two options: betray everything she believed in, or lose the man she loved. And neither choice would let her keep her soul intact. Chapter 10. Katherine had been trapped beyond the veil for 3 days when Julius finally found the answer. It wasn't in ancient texts or council wisdom or magical theory. It was in something far simpler and far more dangerous: the bond itself. Julius stood in the ritual chamber surrounded by his council, all of whom were arguing about safe approaches and measured responses, and the dangers of acting rashly. But Julius had stopped listening hours ago, because safe approaches hadn't brought Katherine back. Measured responses hadn't torn through the barrier that separated them, and the only danger that mattered was the possibility of losing her forever. "There's another way," Julius said quietly, and the room fell silent. Elena looked at him with concern. "Your Majesty, we've explored every option." "Not this one," Julius interrupted. "The bond Katherine and I share, it's still connected. I can feel her even through the veil, faint but present, which means there's a thread linking us across worlds." "Yes," Dorian said slowly, clearly unsure where this was going. "But the thread is too weak to pull her through." "We've tried." "I'm not talking about pulling her through," Julius said, and his voice carried absolute certainty despite the insanity of what he was about to propose. "I'm talking about using the bond as a bridge, following it through the veil to where she is, and bringing her back myself." The room erupted in protests. "That's suicide," Commander Tallis said bluntly. "The moment you step beyond the veil, you'll be in their realm, vulnerable to the Forgotten Court." "I'm already vulnerable," Julius cut him off. "Every moment Katherine is trapped there. Every second I can feel her fear and desperation bleeding through our bond. I'm dying by pieces. So I'd rather die trying to save her than live with the knowledge that I let her stay trapped because I was too afraid to risk myself." Mira stepped forward, her expression both proud and heartbroken. "If you go through," she said gently, "there's no guarantee you'll be able to return. The veil doesn't allow passage easily, especially not for someone of your bloodline. You could end up trapped there with her. Then we'll be trapped together," Julius said simply, "which is still better than being separated." He looked around the room at the faces of people who'd become his trusted advisors, his friends, his family, in all the ways that mattered. "I know this is reckless," Julius continued. "I know it goes against every strategic decision we should make. But Katherine is more than my mate. She's the other half of my soul. And I refuse to abandon her to that place, simply because rescuing her is dangerous." Sophia, the spiritual advisor, studied Julius with eyes that seemed to see too much. "You understand that this might be exactly what the Forgotten Court wants," she said quietly. "They tried to use Seraphina to separate you and failed. They tried to drag Katherine through to manipulate you both and failed. But if you willingly cross the veil to rescue her, you might be giving them exactly the opening they need." "I know," Julius said, "but I also know that love is the strongest magic we have. It's what broke Seraphina's enchantment. It's what completed our bond even when we were both still healing. And it's what's going to bring Katherine home." He turned to Elena and Dorian. "I need you to open a doorway. Use whatever magic is necessary. Pull on whatever power you can access. Create an opening large enough for me to pass through, and keep it stable long enough for me to reach Katherine and bring her back." Elena and Dorian exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that people who'd worked together for decades could manage without words. "If we do this," Elena finally said, "we'll need every magic user in the castle channeling power into maintaining the opening. And even then, you'll have minutes at most before the veil forces itself closed again." "Then make every second count," Julius said. They prepared quickly, because Julius refused to wait another moment while Katherine suffered alone in that gray nightmare. Magic users were summoned from across the castle, forming circles within circles around the ritual chamber, all of them ready to pour their power into creating and maintaining a tier in reality itself. Julius stood in the center, dressed in simple clothes that would allow him to move quickly, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Instead, he focused on the bond, that thread of connection that linked him to Katherine across impossible distance, and sent one clear thought through it: "I'm coming for you. Hold on just a little longer." He didn't know if she heard him. But he felt something pulse back through the bond, faint but unmistakable, that felt like hope mixed with desperate relief. "Ready," Dorian announced, his hands already glowing with gathered magic. Elena joined him, her elderly voice strong as she began chanting in the old language that hurt to hear. One by one, the other magic users added their power, their voices creating a harmonious chord that made the air itself vibrate. And then, with a sound like the world tearing in half, the veil split open. Julius didn't hesitate. The moment the opening appeared, a vertical slash in reality showing gray mist beyond, he stepped through. The transition was like diving into freezing water and burning fire simultaneously. Every nerve in Julius's body screamed in protest as he crossed the threshold between worlds, but he pushed through the pain and emerged into the realm of the forgotten. The gray wasteland stretched before him, oppressive and wrong in ways that made his wolf howl with instinctive terror. But Julius ignored the wrongness and focused on the bond, following it like a compass pointing toward home. Katherine was close. He could feel her now, her fear, her determination, her stubborn refusal to give the forgotten what they wanted even though she was trapped and alone. "Katherine!" Julius shouted, his voice echoing strangely in the mist. "Katherine, where are you?" For a horrible moment, there was only silence. Then he heard her voice, distant but unmistakable, calling back, "Julius, I'm here. Follow the bond." Julius ran toward the sound, his heart pounding with hope and terror in equal measure. The mist tried to confuse him, shifting and swirling to hide his path, but the bond was stronger than illusion. It pulled him forward with absolute certainty until finally, he saw her. Katherine stood in a clearing of sorts, surrounded by shapes that resolved into figures as Julius got closer. The forgotten court, manifested in forms that hurt to look at directly. But Julius only had eyes for Katherine. She looked tired and frightened, but unbroken. Her chin lifted in defiance, even though she was clearly outnumbered. When she saw Julius, her expression crumbled into relief so profound it made his chest ache. "You came," she whispered. "Always," Julius said, reaching her side and pulling her into his arms. "Did you think I wouldn't? How touching," said a voice that came from all the forgotten figures at once. "The Alpha King crosses the veil for his mate." Just as we predicted, Julius turned to face them, keeping Katherine behind him protectively. "You want to use our rescue to escape," Julius said flatly. "Katherine told me through the bond. You think that if we tear through the veil together, we'll create an opening large enough for you to follow." "Clever," the Forgotten acknowledged. "And correct. Your combined bloodlines, working in concert from both sides of the barrier, it would indeed create a permanent doorway." "Then you're going to be disappointed," Katherine said, stepping out from behind Julius to stand beside him instead. "Because we're not tearing anything. We're walking back through the opening that's already been created, and then we're sealing it behind us." The Forgotten laughed, and the sound was like shattering mirrors. "The opening your council created, it will close in mere seconds. You'll never make it back before—" "We will," Julius interrupted, taking Katherine's hand and lacing their fingers together. "Because our bond is stronger than your manipulation. Because love is more powerful than fear. And because you made a critical mistake." He squeezed Katherine's hand, feeling their souls resonate through the completed bond. "You assumed we'd be desperate enough to tear down the veil to save ourselves," Julius continued. "But you forgot that the same bloodlines that created the barrier in the first place also created protections. And one of those protections is that true mates who are properly bonded can pass through without widening the opening at all." The Forgotten went very still. "That's impossible," they hissed. "It's ancient magic," Katherine said, and Julius heard the triumph in her voice. "The kind your manipulation and schemes can't touch. Our ancestors built a doorway for bonded pairs specifically so they could maintain the veil from both sides if needed. Julius and I just completed that bond 3 days ago, which means we have exactly what we need to walk out of here without giving you what you want." Julius could feel the Forgotten's fury building like a storm, could sense them preparing to attack rather than let their prisoners simply leave. "Run!" Julius shouted, and they both took off toward where Julius could feel the opening starting to close. Behind them, the Forgotten shrieked with rage and lunged forward, shadows extending like grasping hands trying to drag them back. But Julius and Katherine ran faster, their hands clasped tight, their bond singing with power that pushed back against the darkness trying to claim them. They reached the opening just as it began to collapse, a narrowing slash of light in the oppressive gray, and threw themselves through it together. The transition back was even more painful than the crossing had been. But Julius barely felt it, because Katherine was with him, solid and real, and finally safe. They tumbled through the opening and crashed to the floor of the ritual chamber, and behind them Dorian and Elena slammed the veil shut with so much force that the magical backlash knocked several people off their feet. For a long moment, there was only the sound of heavy breathing and relieved sobbing. Then Katherine was in Julius's arms, and he was holding her like he'd never let go, and they were both crying and laughing and trying to convince themselves this was real. "You tore through the veil for me," Katherine said through her tears. "You actually crossed into their realm. I'd cross into 1,000 realms for you," Julius said fiercely. "I'd tear down every barrier between worlds. I'd fight every impossible enemy. Because you're mine and I'm yours, and nothing, not ancient curses, not manipulative spirits, not even reality itself, gets to separate us." Katherine kissed him then, pouring every ounce of love and relief and gratitude she couldn't find words for into that single moment of connection. When they finally pulled apart, Mira was there with blankets and water and a smile that said she'd known all along they would make it back. "The mark is gone," Mira said, examining Katherine's wrist. Pulling her through from their side severed the tether completely. Julius examined the unmarked skin himself, then brought Katherine's wrist to his lips and kissed it gently. "You're free," he said softly. "We both are." Elena approached them, looking exhausted but satisfied. "The veil is sealed stronger than before," she reported. "Your passage through it actually reinforced the barrier rather than weakening it. The Forgotten Court won't be able to attempt anything like this again for centuries, if ever." Katherine sagged with relief, and Julius tightened his arms around her. "Then it's over," Katherine said. "Really over. The crisis is over," Julius agreed. "But our story? That's just beginning." He helped Katherine to her feet, and together they left the ritual chamber, walking through castle corridors that felt like home in a way they hadn't before the nightmare began. Because they'd been tested by the worst the universe could throw at them, and they'd survived. Not just survived, they'd grown stronger. The bond between them hummed with contentment, no longer muffled or threatened, just present and powerful, and exactly what both of them needed. And as they reached their chambers, not separate rooms anymore, but shared space because neither could bear to be apart, Katherine turned to Julius with a smile that held all the love and promise of their future. "Thank you," she said simply, "for coming for me, for refusing to give up, for choosing me over safety." "Always," Julius replied, echoing his earlier promise. "In this world or any other, I choose you. Always." Epilogue. 6 months after Katherine returned from beyond the veil, the castle held a ceremony. Not the rushed, desperate bonding ritual from before. This was something different. A celebration of love that had survived impossible odds. A public acknowledgement of a bond that had already been forged in crisis and sealed in choice. Katherine stood in the gardens wearing a gown that actually felt like hers this time. Cream silk embroidered with silver thread that caught the sunlight, and watched as guests from across the kingdom gathered to witness their official mating ceremony. But unlike the first attempt that had ended in disaster, this time Katherine felt only joy. Julius stood at the altar looking impossibly handsome in his formal robes, his eyes never leaving Katherine's face as she walked toward him. Not down an aisle lined with strangers, but through gardens they'd walked together 100 times, past roses they'd named and benches where they'd shared secrets. When Katherine reached him, Julius took her hands and smiled with such genuine happiness that several people in the audience started crying before any vows were even spoken. "We've already done the hard part," Julius said quietly. meant only for her, though everyone could hear in the garden's perfect acoustics. Everything after this is just celebrating what we already know is true. That you're mine and I'm yours, Katherine finished, and that nothing in this world or any other can change that. They spoke their vows, simple and honest, and full of promises they'd already proven they could keep. They exchanged marks, not forced by manipulation or rushed by crisis, but chosen freely and joyfully. And when Julius kissed his mate in front of the gathered kingdom, the bond between them blazed so brightly that several magic-sensitive guests later swore they saw a silver light surrounding the couple like a blessing. The celebration lasted well into the night, but Katherine and Julius eventually slipped away from the crowds to stand alone in the observatory where they'd first begun to truly heal. "Happy?" Julius asked, wrapping his arms around Katherine from behind as they looked out at the star-filled sky. "Impossibly happy," Katherine admitted. 6 months ago, I didn't think we'd survive. Didn't think love could be strong enough to overcome everything trying to tear us apart. But it was, Julius said softly. "It is," Katherine corrected. Present tense. Because this isn't an ending. It's a beginning. We have our whole lives ahead of us now. "Then let's make them extraordinary," Julius said. And as they stood together watching stars wheel overhead, Katherine thought about everything they'd overcome. Betrayal and enchantment, broken trust and impossible choices, literal tears in reality and ancient enemies. They'd survived all of it, not because they were perfect or because their love was effortless, but because they'd chosen each other repeatedly, even when choosing was terrifying. "I love you," Katherine said, turning in Julius's arms to face him. "Not because destiny said I should or because ancient bonds required it, but because you're you and I'm me, and somehow we fit together in a way that makes both of us better." "I love you too," Julius replied. "In this world and any other, through every crisis and every quiet moment, forever." They kissed under the stars, and somewhere in the distance the veil held strong, reinforced by the power of a bond that had proven stronger than darkness. And in the castle below, guests celebrated a love that had survived the impossible and emerged victorious. Because sometimes, just sometimes, fairy tales were real after all. Just not the sanitized versions that skipped over the hard parts. The real version included heartbreak and healing, mistakes and forgiveness, fear and courage. And that version, Katherine thought as Julius held her close, was so much better than any fairy tale could ever be. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Comment below on which part moved you the most. Was it the scene where Katherine saw Julius mark Serafina? Was it when he crossed the veil to rescue her? Or was it the moment when they finally completed their true bond? And tell me, would you have forgiven Julius after everything that happened? Or would you have done the same as Katherine and run into the forest? If you liked this story of love, overcoming adversity, and supernatural magic, leave a like and share it with someone who also loves stories about wolves and destiny. And don't forget, there's a new video here on the channel every day, so subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss any stories. Comment your name and where you're watching from. I read all the comments and love getting to know you. See you in the next video.